right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that's not too loud. Can everybody hear me? All right. Is it too loud? Okay, good. Well, we're getting a little bit of a late start, but I thought we'd make every moment count. And we have really a sterling panel here that will explain the issue that we are going to discuss. I'll just give a little roadmap. We, of course, have dinner that follows this. So we will end at 7:45. So it gives us a little bit, an hour and 15 minutes, slightly less than we expected. But I know there are going to be a lot of questions, so we'll make sure that we have a lot of time for that. I'm Jill Doherty, and I think you know some of the panel, but just in case, we have, beginning at the other end, Mr. Valdis Dombrovskis, who is Vice President for European and Social Dialogue, and he is also, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but he is in charge of Financial Stability, Financial Services, and Capital Markets Union. Then we have Dana Reznice. Then we have the Minister of Finance, Dana Reznice Ozwola. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
That's fine, thank you.
Next, Christian Whiten, who is the Senior Vice President of Banner Public Affairs, also an expert in economic issues. And finally, Professor Dr. Michael Eilfort, who is the director of the Market Economic Foundation. So I hope we'll be ready for a discussion. You know, I was thinking when I was asked to do this, my field actually is Russia more than economics, so I may ask some very basic questions. But I was thinking about Latvia when I arrived, that I came here for the first time in 1971, which is a very long time ago. And I've been back many times since. And I was thinking that this panel has the mission of asking a pretty specific and directed question about the economic prospects, the outlook for the EU. But there are broader issues that I think we all see. There are broader questions about where economies are going, where globalization is going, where Brexit is going, the changing economic perspective of the leadership in the United States. There are these kind of, I think of them as a turning point, or at least a watershed in economic history, that we're looking at a very different world. It seemed cataclysmic when I was here as a very young person in 1971, but right now, to me, it feels cataclysmic as well, but for different reasons, and maybe even less predictable. We have threats, certainly unclear path on Brexit, protectionism, nationalism, geopolitical tensions, etc. So as we go through these, you know, feel free to ask questions. Really, they can be broadly philosophical or they can be very topical. I think for me, having spent a lot of time in the eastern part of Europe and in Russia, the essential question is how people live. You know, do people have better lives? Do they have jobs? Do they have education and economic prospects or not? And if they don't, then it creates political problems. And political problems can create certainly conflicts, military conflicts. So that's one aspect of it. But let's go to the task at hand, which is, I think we'll give you a chance to have some opening comments by answering that question. What would you say on our panel, what are the prospects, economic prospects for the EU and for the United States right now? And Minister Dombrovskis, could we start with you?
Yep.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for this invitation to Riga conference. So as regards economic developments in EU and broader global economic developments, one can say that the economic tendencies in EU remain positive. We have solid economic growth expected at somewhere 2.1% both this year and next, based on sound fundamentals. So we see that economy will continue to develop. So what are potential risk factors? One, of course, is the ongoing Brexit negotiations and Brexit, which is expected in March next year. But it must be said that so far the effect on the 27 EU member states has been quite limited. But what we have emphasized also in our European Commission summer economic forecast, that actually we see economic risks on the downside. So what are those downside risks? There is a possibility of escalation of the trade conflicts, which is basically already seeing. Also, if we talk about US economy, imbalances potentially stemming from pro-cyclical fiscal policy of the US, and there are also vulnerabilities emerging in a number of emerging markets related to the high debt and leverage levels in economy. So what we need to do at the EU level now is basically to prepare to face those economic downside risks. Because in any case, we know that economy develops in a pro-cyclical way. So it means that if we are now in a 6th year of economic growth, we need to be ready for potential next economic downturn. And for this, we need to do several things. We need to strengthen the resilience of EU economy by improving European-level shock absorption tools. That's, for example, why European Commission has proposed European Investment Stabilization Function to help sustain levels of public investment in case of member states facing economic shocks. And we need to strengthen the resilience of EU economy, for which we need structural reforms. That's why we have proposed also a new reform support program in the next multi-annual financial framework to provide financial incentives for structural reforms in member states. And finally, what we need to do is also, given the fact that we are now having 6th year of economic growth, we need to rebuild the fiscal buffers, so to put budget deficit and debt clearly on downwards path, so that we have fiscal room of maneuver should the next economic downturn come. Thank you.
Thank you. And Madam Minister?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I would also like to thank you for this great opportunity to participate in this Riga conference. I would probably more concentrate on the preconditions, what are needed for further development of the European Union. You very well know that Europe, as we see it today, was built actually on 2 basic pillars after the Second World War. We're hoping for the re-establishment of the security in the continent, and growing and developing the welfare of the people. And these are 2 basic aspects that are still keeping us together today. And there are some basic principles that have to be kept in mind, not to lose it. If for the welfare, it might be enough if we concentrate on fiscal responsibility, we keep the vigilance and implement the reforms. Then talking about the security, we should not forget the importance of the unity, the single and strong, and sometimes even sharp, common voice of Europe. So shortly, still about the reforms. Yes, this is the very good time for Europe. Last year was the first year when each and every European country had a positive growth rate. We do have the lowest unemployment rate since the pre-crisis period in the continent. So this is the time when we need to implement the structural reforms for our sustainable development in the future. And this is what the Commission also understands very well, and that's the reason why the country-specific recommendations are prepared for each and every country. But what is the reality? A lot of these recommendations are not being implemented by the countries. Countries think that they know better what to do. They do implement the reforms. But one of the problems might be really that the fact that there is a lack of the ownership of the reforms proposed by the Commission. Because there is this feeling and sense that the Commission is sitting as the great expert somewhere in the ivory tower and giving the recommendations, criticizing sometimes the implementation of those, allocating some funding. But what is of vital importance, we know that if it is a real reform, it's never easy. It's always difficult, painful, sometimes even politically very unpopular, and which is even more important than the money, it is the advice and practical help that should be provided by the Commission. If, for example, one country is implementing the health reform, then the commissioner responsible for the health have to live or work in the country, I mean, helping the ministers, helping the government with the publicity, with the advice, with also the money. And if the reform fails or is not implemented, then we do have a reason for that. We need to create this ownership, that there is the sense of this necessity of the reforms. Another aspect that I would like to mention, there are several country-specific recommendations that are repeated each and every year for a lot of countries, never fully implemented, which means that either they are too general or those are the issues to be solved at the supranational level. Such recommendations like decreasing of inequality and poverty reduction, dealing with aging problem, which is a real problem. In 2050, you know that the average age in Europe would be more than 50 years, 52. That's the expectations. Lack of skills. So, and the real common policies have to be implemented. But how can you implement the common policies in Europe, like the common social policy in Europe, if the convergence level is so low, if there's so big differences in the productivity levels and living standards among the countries, which means different, sometimes contradictory interests among the countries. So that's why cohesion is still important. Those were the comments on the reforms. Just to touch upon the security and common voice principle, we do have to understand that we live on the edge of a geopolitical tectonic plate here in the region. And even if at the moment we probably do not see the issues on the headlines, it doesn't mean that the security issue on the EU eastern border have dissolved. Sometimes it does really seem that we have become relaxed, but it doesn't mean that the opposite side has stopped to sharpen their knives, both the physical and virtual, like information and other virtual elements of today's warfare. If you see that from the one side, there are the biggest military trainings and exercises carried out, and on the other side, there are the soft and tender voices in Europe urging to decrease the sanctions, to improve the relationship in a constructive manner. Mm-hmm. So there's some contradiction built in the very basis of the situation already. The lack of the integrity and the common voice is used very smartly. Look at the projects like Nord Stream 2. The very principle, very core of this project, built in it, has already been meant to ensure the economic and geopolitical division in Europe. And what we are doing, we are just following it. if we want to be strong, we have to be united. It's like, the hand. One finger, what can you then do with one finger? You can tap the computer letters, send some SMS, pinpoint to something. But if you've got 5 fingers together, you can greet the person much better than with one finger. You can hug the person, and you can sometimes defend yourself much better. Mm-hmm. That's important to keep and to reach the goals others in the world are only thinking of.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So we're already getting a theme. I think reforms, later on perhaps we can drill down what kind of reforms specifically. But Christian, you are from Washington, D.C., and we know many things are happening in Washington, D.C. So, in my theme of big ideas and history, I was thinking the very institutions that exist, that were created after World War II, are the institutions that are perhaps, you could argue, under threat, and they are under threat from some people in the United States who seem to think that they don't work anymore, and that you Europeans are freeloaders. But, Christian, what's your perspective? I mean, a lot of interesting things have come up already.
They have, Jill, and thank you. And I'll throw out some big ideas, but not too big, since I know we're the only thing standing between you and dinner. So try and keep it moving along. I'm not going to tell you anything more about Europe than you know, or the European economy. I'm not an expert in that. I've been at the State Department in the U.S. as a political appointee in the Bush administration, most recently in the Trump administration, and was on the Trump transition and the campaign before that. So I have a different perspective. Maybe we call it the tale of two Europes. And what I could talk about is the way the U.S., I think, views itself, at least the administration, views the economy and the role that that plays in statecraft. If you look at the U.S. economy, we now have the highest consumer confidence in 18 years. And this is well earned. This isn't hype. It's a reflection of real changes in the economy that have manifested themselves. We have annual growth now that's averaging 3% on an annual basis if you look over the sweep of 2018. And just going to the second quarter of 2018, ending June 30th, we're almost at the end of the third quarter now. But we had really staggering growth for an economy of our size and level of development, 4.2% annualized growth. The stock market, all the indexes, all the major indexes at or near all-time highs. Unemployment in the United States at or near all-time lows, both generally and specifically broken down. If you look at minorities, if you look at women, all-time lows. And also a key change, a fundamental change that we haven't seen really since the late 1990s. Wages are finally starting to increase and to grow faster than inflation, around 3%, in fact, recently. There had been this whole theory that was developed during the Obama administration called secular stagnation. It was espoused by economists like Paul Krugman, a left-leaning economist at the left-leaning New York Times, that had basically been developed to explain how large economies like the US, like the EU, could no longer grow at rapid rates. The 3% growth, 4% growth, distant memory, not going to happen again. Something had changed, we're not sure what, we'll call it secular stagnation. That, I would argue, has been discredited by recent developments. A lot of this being driven by tax cuts, which will be very long-term. The ones on individuals last a very long time. And the significant tax cuts on corporations that took U.S. corporate taxes from 35%, some of, I think the first or second highest in the OECD, down to one of the lowest, 21% corporate tax rate, which is also, in addition to giving corporations more of their profits to keep and reinvest, has seen a repatriation of a great deal of cash, including, frankly, from Europe, that had been kept here by high U.S. taxes. U.S. corporations hold, or at least held, something like $2.6 trillion in cash overseas as late as last year. And you also have the prospects of future growth. The way you calculate GDP, of course, is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. And net exports is always a negative number for the U.S. because of our large trade deficits. If President Trump succeeds in bringing those trade deficits down, that will lead to a higher GDP number. And perhaps we can talk a little bit later about trade, but some big developments also with monetary policy. Because the economy is growing well, we've been able to raise interest rates. That means if there ever is a crisis, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, will actually have ammunition to use, an ability to lower rates to stimulate growth that you can't do if you have your interest rates at or near zero, which is where they were for so much of the last decade, really a lost decade of economic growth beginning around 2007. And potentially trade. I work for a think tank and I work for a lobbying firm. We have a lot of clients very concerned about trade developments in the United States, and it really is an issue that was dead for so long that has sprung back to life. Very controversial. The administration did just sign trade agreements with South Korea and Mexico. Those soon should be heading to Congress for passage. Canada may or may not join this soon. It's their choice to make. And of course, you have negotiations going on with the EU, with Japan, with China. I think probably ranking those, Japan is the most likely. The EU is, I think, a little farther off, and China, I think, is very unlikely given the amount of structural changes that would have to take place. So you have immense U.S. growth in the U.S. economy that's been unexpected and a long time since we last exhibited this, and a very different view in how we view economics and statecraft. Now, again, I'll try and keep this to my most acerbic points, if you'll forgive me, but tale of two economies. Things here, growth, Latvia, very impressive, 4%. EU, more broadly, not that impressive, 2% or less, and especially it seems to be trending down in the major economies and the biggest economies. You have Brexit, and we're not devoting this panel to that, but it's been mentioned before. And as we look at this from the outside, of course, the United States is often regarded as having a special relationship with Britain, with the United Kingdom. This seems headed toward a conflagration, toward a hard Brexit come next March. And while Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Britain, certainly has not done yeoman's work in managing Brexit, which she opposed when it was on the ballot and put before British voters. The EU doesn't seem to be exactly bending over backwards to make this process run smoothly and effectively. And you just had a meeting, I gather, in Salzburg that did not end well and does not look like an agreement on Brexit is coming anytime soon. You have other major economies, France, very slow growth. You had President Macron at the UN comment that he wasn't going to pursue commercial agreements with countries that don't respect the Paris Climate Accord. Regardless of your views on climate change, having that as a criteria to where you're going to focus your trade liberalization doesn't sound like a recipe for trade liberalization or economic growth. And finally, major cloud on the horizon is, in fact, negotiations with the United States. There was supposedly a meeting of the minds between President Trump and Juncker about an agreement, perhaps a big agreement that would wipe away tariffs across a number of categories between the US and the EU, and there are some very significant ones. For example, cars that are imported to the United States face only a 2.5% tariff. That's cars and SUVs. Some categories are much higher. But the EU has a 10% tariff on cars. If you take the messaging of what looked like a quick breakthrough and what the stock market thought would be a relatively quick breakthrough in talks with the Europeans, leading to an agreement in fall, that now looks like the messaging, at least that people in Washington understand, is that's looking much more like spring, which frankly isn't going to be fast enough, I don't think, for the current U.S. administration, which then would levy tariffs on cars even higher coming out of Europe. And of course, you have energy prices on the rise with oil near $80 a barrel. And the result, as I say, is growth that's much lower in the EU than in the United States. So just to sum up, there are also, again, from the American perspective, from a more pro-Trump perspective, admittedly, cultural problems in the EU. You had Chancellor Merkel of Germany, who led 1 million Muslim immigrants from a war zone into Europe, having consulted with seemingly no one outside of Germany, if there, and that now driving a wave of political change. We saw just recently, very recently, in Sweden. We've also seen it in Italy, Austria, with minority parties in Germany and elsewhere. You know this better than I do, but it doesn't look exactly placid from the outside. And so, I think a potential big idea, takeaway point are this assumption that membership in the EU, membership in NATO is the recipe for economic and security success, and perhaps it was in the 90s and the late 90s and 2000s. I'm not sure is anymore. Not that there's necessarily an obvious alternative, but what seems to be in the offing in Europe seems to be, somewhat troublesome as far as an outlook goes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Christian. And finally, we have Michael. I can already see a hand from Minister Dombrovskis. But Michael, you go ahead and tell us how you take this.
Yes. Following our moderator, I'd like to start with Bill Clinton, who said, it's the economy, stupid. So economy is for the well-being of the people, is for social cohesion, but for much more. If ever Europe would economically weaken, it's for sure that probably Europe won't be stronger on defense and political issues. So it's really about economy. Clinton is right, and I'm not trying to predict the consequences of the Brexit because I'm not able to. I'm not trying to predict Donald Trump. I'm not trying to predict the outcome of some trade conflicts. I'm just making 3 points which are quite certain for Europe. First point, there are much more risks for the euro, or in between the eurozone, that we consider today. The ice is very thin for the euro, especially if you take into account what comes from Italy today, is one more sign. But the ice is very thin, and under the surface in the last years there was much progress, and of course in good years, in economically good years, a lot of nations in Europe and in the Eurozone made less debts. That's true. But under the surface you have to realize too that from the point when Mario Draghi from the European Central Bank said whatever it takes in 2012, the willingness for reforms and the intensity of reforms on the national level, the European Commission did a lot, but on the national level, the willingness for reforms declined since 2012, and since 2015, since Greece was kept in the Eurozone, we have no longer austerity, but we have fiscal expansion. So under the surface, there are a lot of things that are not very good for the outlook of the next years in the Eurozone. Second point, we have official state debts from the past, so credits and so on. Germany, for example, 2 trillion euros, official state debt. But we have hidden and secret or implicit state debts too. That's resulting from unfunded governmental or government commitments, for example, for pensions. So German government and other governments too, they promise pensions, they promise health care, they are promising health care, long-term care and so on, without building reserves for all these people. That means that you have future debts that are for sure, and these are debts you have to take into account. And in 24 out of 28 countries of the EU, Eurozone, out or in the Eurozone, you have an amount of implicit hidden debts that increases the official debts these states have. Latvia is much better off than Germany, but Latvia too is among those 24 states. Third point, after the euro and the hidden debts, demographic challenge. If you split the world into 9 zones, you have six zones, and if you take the average annual growth between 2016 and 2020, so 2 results and 3 forecasts, average annual growth in 5 years up to 2020. You have 6 regions in the world which with a growth between 3% and 6%. You have 6 regions. You have 3 regions with a growth around 2%. That's Japan, Australia, that's the United States and Canada, and that's Europe. And if I'm asking, what do these 3 regions have in common? I mean, it's not the Western values that makes economies growing slower. What they have in common is they have aging populations. And the old age dependence ratio is going up. They have baby boomers who will soon reach their pension age. So it's not only that the state has to do more funding with an aging society, more funding for health, for long-term care and for pensions. The second effect is that the working age people are less in numbers, so there are less contributions and less taxes which comes to the state. And there's a third factor, a psychological factor, very important and very visible in Germany, which is at the summit of the problem with Japan. People, when they, not the people here, of course, they are all exceptions, but in average, in general, if they reach an age between 53 and 55, they are more inclined to preserve, protect, and defend than to change or to create. Innovation is not for elderly people. So, if you have an aging population, in the US, they will have the problem starting in 2040. In Germany, 2025, it will be a serious problem. If you have aging societies, you are less innovative, you are less inclined to do new infrastructure. It's not possible to construct an airport or a train station in Germany without protest of elderly people saying, it's not to my advantage. I have nothing of that. So this is very important, a very important point, an underestimated point for Europe and for the European Union as a whole. There are differences in age, but in general, we are a little bit, it's nice to have growing life expectancy. I'm completely happy about that, but we have to see that we have to do more for education, more for innovation, and that in Europe we have to become much slower in decision-making and in a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I've now decided that I should color my hair just to make sure that I'm in line with what you are saying. Valdis, did you have something that you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to some of the points raised on US economic development and trade. Currently, indeed, we see a strong economic performance in US. What I mentioned in introductory remarks, we have certain concerns on imbalances which are coming from pro-cyclical fiscal stimulus, because tax reform amounted to massive fiscal stimulus, but it amounted to massive fiscal stimulus during the boom years, which then may lead to certain economic imbalances building up, and as a result forcing also Fed to go for more aggressive monetary tightening. So there are certain trade-offs involved. But my main point, which I wanted to say, was on trade. On trade, indeed, as you know, we had difficult discussions with US, and following the meeting between President Trump and President of European Commission, Mr. Juncker, it was the further escalation of this trade conflict was avoided, so we put our tariffs on hold and are currently negotiating. As regards industrial goods, everyone likes to talk about cars. Indeed, it's true that tariffs of 2.5% in US and 10% in Europe. Then if you look at the light truck tariffs, it's 25% tariff in US and only 10% tariff in EU. And EU actually came with a proposal, okay, if you complain about too high car tariffs, let's go to zero tariffs for cars, light trucks. And then US came back and said, oh, we had second thoughts about this. But okay, I think the good thing is that we are not escalating it anymore, we are actually negotiating. But what we are worried about is this unilateral approach, because we think that we need to preserve multilateral rules-based system, and if there are trade conflicts, and there are always trade conflicts, that they need to be dealt within this framework, respecting the role of WTO, World Trade Organization, and not in this unilateral way, because this then I would say undermines the role of international rules-based system. That, I would say, is our worry there. Then as regards as regards also some grounds of raising tariffs, if it's a national security grounds, of course, we have some questions whether US is considering Europe as a threat to the national security. We are considering US a strategic ally, so certainly there is some scope for discussion, but the good news is that we are currently discussing it.
Okay. You know, I wanted very quickly just to get to the point of specifics on reforms. I want to get to questions, but could we quickly, at least the people who do have opinions on the reforms that need to be carried out, probably, Donna, I think you do, could we quickly say what are the top one or two reforms that Europe should be carrying out now?
There are several. I mean, those that are already carried out, trying to motivate the countries to keep the sound fiscal policies, completing the banking union, capital markets union. But I would also concentrate on several others, which is about the skills. And which is dealing with this aging issue that was raised already by the colleagues in the panels. You know that in talking about the skills, in a few years, Europe will need tens of millions of IT specialists. But the reality is that half of the European people do not have the basic skills in information technologies. So, and aging, I think that's one thing that the European Commission and European leaders in general might think of. What has always been the strong side of the big leaders? They know how to speak to the hearts of the people, not only to the brain. So why not to establish and implement the common European level demographic support program that would have the practical effect, getting us younger as the continent, and that would also have the emotional part, so that the people, the families would feel that, oh, Europe is thinking about me, because the demographics is a crucial part. I was recently, a few months ago, participating in one of the World Bank's conferences on the panel about the demographic issues, and it is really scary when we are talking about the challenges in the demographics, that some of the countries and even continents are talking about their experiences, how they are using their religious leaders just to remind the ladies to use their pills in order to restrict the birth rates, while we are, you know, generating the creative ideas how to boost the birth rates. So the world is so different, and we need to think and think of and see the problems that we have to solve here, not running after the rest of the world in very many issues.
Anybody else who wanted to comment on that?
Sure, I would just argue that to think big as far as reform goes, just take a look at the fundamental promise of the EU, a common foreign policy, a common military policy, and an economic policy that is common and delivers prosperity, and it's delivered on none of those things, really. The problem with the EU is you give up your ability to set trade policy and your ability to set up monetary policy. So case in point, as the minister mentioned, there was a discussion about going to zero tariffs in the United States, between the United States and the EU. But the problem is that we want broader liberalization across a number of categories, not just cars, and the French don't want to liberalize agriculture at all. That's fine if they want to do that, but that is actually prohibiting now or inhibiting the ability of the EU to reach a deal, and the result will be higher and higher tariffs. Similarly, monetary policy, when you give that up as a country by joining the euro, joining the EU, you get the monetary policy of Europe. Does it make sense for example, Italy and Greece, countries that frankly need to inflate their currencies at certain times, frankly, which are not as productive, whose workers do not work as long hours as Germans do? Does it make sense for them to have the same currency as Germany? Germany, with its massive exports, with its massive balance of trade surplus, does it make sense for it to have the same currency? It certainly helps with its exports, but it does create imbalances which are now causing political problems. So I would look at the fundamentals when it comes to reform.
Valdis, I think you had one question.
Well, yes,
comment?
indeed. I
Very
think I feel
provocative.
compelled to come back to this. So maybe just a couple of points. First, EU is a single market. And if you want to have a single market with free movements of goods, services, capital, and labor,
And
you
energy.
need to have common economic rules and common basis, including common trade policy. So you cannot set external tariffs each country separately and then trade without any tariffs, without any customs barriers within the EU single market. But I think it's widely acknowledged that EU single market actually has been driver of economic growth, and I wouldn't agree that it has not brought prosperity. It has brought prosperity. Europe is one of the most prosperous regions in the world, and actually it's one of the most equal regions if we talk about income inequality in the world. So I think there's a good track record. But then with a single market, of course, came the question, what about currencies? And something we saw before Euro, that countries were engaging in what was called competitive currency devaluations. Not that it was very much liked by citizens, which wake up one morning and discover, oh, surprise, your currency is worth 30% less. But in any case, that's why the exchange rate mechanism 1 was introduced, and then later it moved to exchange rate mechanism 2, euro, and with euro you can really see that it has brought back price stability, which was absent in times when EU, or at that time it was called European Economic Communities, was trying to set up a single market, but each country devaluing against each other. So that clearly was not sustainable path. Of course, it is true that once you have a common currency, responsible fiscal policy, responsible macroeconomic policy becomes even more important. And that's why we are also having common EU fiscal rules. That's why we have so-called European semester, so the governance cycle of fiscal and macroeconomic surveillance. So all this is needed, but I would say if you look ultimately, having a single market is a major boost for European economy, and I think it's truly something which we need to cherish and develop further.
Okay, and Michael.
I completely agree that the common market is a wonderful boost and basis for Europe. But what I do wish first is more application of the rules. We have wonderful rules and wonderful institutions in Europe, and things are nicely set up, but we don't apply and accept them. And just to start with the European semester, between 2011 and 2017, the EU Commission gave more than 800 recommendations to the national governments in Europe. More than 800 reform recommendations, and only 13 are fully implemented in 6 or 7 years. So on the national level, there is much to do then. A second point, we really should find a common solution in Europe for migration. What Germany did on its own in 2015 was not very smart on a political point of view. It was not good as example for Europe, and it was economically stupid because the wrong people came, except of those in Syria where they had war, and that was a good thing to accept them. But in the majority, the wrong people came. So we should find a common solution in Europe for qualified migration. We need that. And the third point is it's once again youth and the generation problem. In Germany, not only in Germany, Germany is the first and the oldest country, but the others follow. So demography is for sure in the next 2-3 decades. In Germany, we complain of lack of qualified workers. But what we do in the same time, because the majority of the voters in Germany is over 55, what leads to the effect that in election campaigns, we only discuss to rise pensions. We don't discuss youth issues. We just discuss elderly people. So, and we give the signal to young people, they know they are few, they know they have to pay double for the pensions, but they know that themselves they won't get anything in their age. And this makes that in Germany, since 2005 already, since 2005, more Germans or more people with German passport leave Germany than come back to Germany. So we have a clear tendency, and these people are not elderly people going to Spain because the German winter is so cold. No, it's young people between 25 and 35, highly qualified people. So we have to do something against that too.
Michael, where are they going? Where are they going?
To the United States, to Great Britain, to Australia.
Okay. I think it's time to open up for some questions. So I see a few hands back there. We have the microphone. Sir, you right there? Yes, can we get a microphone to that man? Oh, then we'll get to you.
Thank you, Robert Dalsjö, Swedish Defence Research. I had the impression that this panel, like the previous panel, assumes things basically stay on track and avoids the really nasty issues. Now, the centrifugal forces in Europe are many and getting stronger, while the forces of cohesion are few and getting weaker. Angela Merkel has single-handedly held Europe together for 10 years. Now it looks like she might fall. It looks like May might fall. And we may have a trade war over the Atlantic. How well prepared is Europe for such a political storm and its economic consequences?
Great question. Who wants to take it? Valdis.
Well, on this, indeed, something we touched upon already, whether we call it centrifugal forces or wave of populism or whatever. First, to get some facts. Indeed, we are currently dealing with a Brexit, but at the same time, immediately after this, 27 member states said very clear that they see their future together and they are determined to make EU a success. So 27 member states will stick together. If you look at the public opinion, so the recent public opinion polls shows that 2/3 of Europeans consider EU being a good thing for their country. It's actually the highest figure since 1983. So also there we should get track record right. Then, of course, this populism way exists, and we need to deal with this. And one important element, I believe, has to do with income inequality. Because, yes, Europe has the most equal society in the world, but if you look at the developments in income inequality, it has grown in all major economies. The growth in Europe has been the slowest, but still, inequality has grown. It's a fact. So we need to deal with this and need to put forward policies, both in taxation, in social policies, in education policies, that brings down income inequality and makes all Europeans to feel the benefits of economic growth we have been talking about.
Mm-hmm. I would just shortly add on. Yes, there is the sense of a continuous segregation, if I may call it in Europe, right after the initiation of the Brexit. And actually, the President Macron taking his position, we see that there is this division, the old and big member states, the smaller and younger ones, the north versus the south. Why? Probably there is this this reason that Angela Merkel has always, and Germany in general, has always played the role of the Europe's mama, taking the care of the younger Eastern European and Baltic countries. Now, when she's so much involved in the domestic affairs, she doesn't have so much energy and power to do with the European issues. And President Macron, who is a very charismatic person, he is taking the leading role in Europe, and he's the one who is always, you know, letting us feel this sense of Europe going further in the direction of the two-speed continent, if I may say so. There is one boat of France, Germany, probably Spain and Italy, that they want to get on board, and the rest, if you can, then jump on it. If not, then probably you are left behind. And this is an urgency that I feel that we have to remind the political leaders that Europe is strong only if it's if there is the principle of solidarity kept strong, and that even if we keep ourselves united, then we can make the benefits out of the single market and the structures that we have already established.
Mm-hmm. You know, we're getting some questions from Skype, and specifically they're talking about income inequality. And of course, in the United States, it's much worse than it is in Europe. But let's go to the next question. There was a man, yes, right there. Thank you. In the back.
Hi, this is Adriano Bosoni. I'm with Stratfor. So I have two different questions. They are rather tactical, but we'll ask them anyway. The first one is for Commissioner Dombrovskis. It seems to me that when President Macron was elected last year, he gave new momentum to the process of the European reform with ideas such as the completion of the banking union, the creation of the European Monetary Fund. But then the EU had other priorities to deal with, such as Brexit or the trade frictions with the US. And now, in a few months, there will be the election for the European Parliament and a new European Commission after that. So my question is the reform momentum lost in Europe? Do the Europeans have to wait at least another year before something structural can be changed? And the second question is for Mr. Whittam. You mentioned agriculture, which is a very interesting thing, because when President Juncker and President Trump released their common press release after their meeting, agriculture was not included. But after that, American officials started saying that the US does want to include agriculture, which will be a very difficult thing for the European Union to accept. So my question to you is, how committed is the Trump administration to actually push to include agriculture? And if you think it is, how likely it is the United States to finally impose tariffs on European cars? Thank you.
Sure, please.
Okay, so I will start with the first question on reforms of Eurozone or Economic and Monetary Union. You mentioned European Monetary Fund, completion of the banking union. Actually, there is more. First, I would say that this reform momentum is not lost. It's maybe not making headlines every single day, but the work is still ongoing. And we are actually finalizing now the work on so-called banking package, which is, if you want, risk reduction part in the banking union, so introducing internationally agreed standards in the EU legislation. We are making progress, and hopefully we will be able to finalize soon the work on the fiscal backstop for Single Resolution Fund, and we are moving towards political discussions on European deposit insurance scheme. This one is moving slowly, it must be admitted so. Then on European Monetary Fund, currently there are less discussions about European Monetary Fund, not least for the reasons that European Central Bank objected, saying that you cannot call this institution monetary because there is only one monetary institution in Eurozone, and it's European Central Bank. So we probably will stick with the old name, European Stability Mechanism, but at the same time we are having discussions on how we further develop role and strengthen the European stability mechanisms. Actually, I had a meeting with Klaus Regling just last week to discuss exactly this, and also in this area we're making progress. So I would say this agenda of EMU deepening is on, and we hope to close quite a few items still until the next European elections.
And if I may add on, some new and vital elements are coming into the game, like within the context of the banking union, AML and CTF issues have also been included, the issues that have been neglected earlier in the day.
Regarding the question on tariffs and agriculture and negotiations, I think tariffs are probably quite likely, just a hunch, but as you've noted, we want Trump, made the offer at the G7 in Canada that he wants no tariffs across the board, truly free trade. Also, that means respect for intellectual property. That could be another sticking point. One of the key innovations, if you will, of the new U.S.-South Korea agreement is an agreement for a 10-year patent on biologic drugs. These are more promising pharmaceuticals, and there is a sense in the administration and elsewhere that sick Americans essentially subsidize a lot of the cost of drug development for other countries that have either price controls or much shorter patent protection. So those issues remain unresolved and remain on the horizon. The only thing that there are two things I'd keep in mind that would work against the application of higher tariffs by the U.S. on Europe. One is just timing. As I said, we have agreements completed with South Korea and Mexico, but pending with China, Japan, the EU, of course, Canada. If all of those, and I think China is a very unlikely breakthrough, but if Canada and the others in Japan really appear not to be going well, that might put the administration in a more conciliatory mood. But there's really not a lot of political pressure on Trump to make a deal, to change his path. Going into the 2020 re-election season, this is a benefit for him. He certainly has received some gripes about the tariffs from Congress, including members of his own party, but it's yet to manifest itself in any real political force.
Okay. More questions? Yes, the gentleman right there with the beard. Can we get a microphone?
Hello, my name is Dieter Dels. I'm a journalist from Reuters News Agency. And speaking of the risks to the EU, I would like to ask a question to Mr. Dombrovskis regarding the latest developments in Italy. I would like to know whether the European Commission will accept the budget proposal from Italy. We know that they have proposed a budget which is exceeding the rules, namely 2.4%. And will the Commission reject it in October? And then the second question, do you have any fears that this budgetary move by Italy could actually trigger a financial crisis in that country and consequently in the whole Eurozone? Thank you.
Okay, concerning this question, of course, we'll be able to give a formal European Commission's opinion once the draft budgetary plan will be submitted, which is by mid-October. But what emerges so far from the discussions does not seem to be in line with the Stability and Growth Pact. Then, as regards economic implications, I think in case of Italy, of course, it's important that it stays on track with responsible fiscal policies, because Italy has a second highest debt to GDP ratio in the EU and the highest debt servicing costs in the EU. So clearly interest rate developments are of major importance for Italy, and to keep interest rates low, it's important to stick with responsible fiscal policies.
I think there was a question next. Yes, thank you. Oh, you have the microphone? Okay.
I do. Thank you. My name is Didis Mēģis. I'm a Latvian business journalist. My question is to Mr. Witten. Wouldn't it be a good idea to start free trade agreement discussions between EU and the US? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, thank you for the question. I think that is sort of the gist of what the U.S. negotiators want. We're talking about a free trade agreement between the U.S. and the EU. Is that right? I mean, the idea that you would take the current system, which actually does have unequal tariffs and imbalances, and try and replace it with something that's genuinely level across a number of fields, I think is sort of part of the impetus now. It's just, the question of seeing whether the political will exists on both sides of the Atlantic.
Since a couple of journalists have asked questions, and I'm kind of a reformed journalist, I just want to jump in with this question of income inequality in societies, because it seems to me, obviously, that fuels a lot of societal problems and can be very dangerous. And in the United States, even though, albeit there is economic growth now, et cetera, you still have a lot of Americans, and you can look at other countries where this is happening, who feel that they are left out of this. and that globalization is bad, that trading with other countries might be dangerous. And so at the same time that you have growth in the stock market for people of means, you have people without means who feel very divorced from that. So, Michael, I'm sorry, Christian, how does the Trump administration blend those two ideas? You could make it very simplistic and say that the rich supporters are doing well, but the average people or the poorer people are really doing worse and worse. How do you answer questions like that?
Well, I'd say that's just not borne out by statistics. Of course, that was the criticism of, for example, the 1980s. In reality, some of the most stark income inequality grew over the last decade, where much of the wealth was created in the stock market, in part to a wildly expansionist monetary policy. The fact that you actually couldn't get a return in debt pushed people to the stock market, and we like to talk about everyone has 401ks. That's a retirement account that many Americans have, many middle class to upper middle class Americans have, that are typically invested in equities. But that doesn't help the lower middle class, which incidentally were the same people who switch parties, people in places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan who typically voted Democrat but who voted for Donald Trump. I think the answer is, in fact, jobs, and particularly manufacturing jobs. There was this idea that we were going to have all these great service economy jobs. We had technology, which also is tremendously beneficial to the U.S., and particularly top line U.S. GDP. But as far as the number of people who have jobs in that field and benefit, it's not a huge part of the population. You know, a lot of people are sort of starting to worry that there's inflation in the U.S., but there's some that's genuinely good, I'd say, which is finally wage inflation, the idea that wages are growing faster than the inflation rate. So that's something that some economists worry about that I would say is actually a good sign, and that the decision not to write off manufacturing jobs, not to sort of assume that, well, we're going to lose manufacturing to other countries sort of as a matter of inevitability, and let's just focus on what we do well, but to actually make a determination that we want to have factories and manufacturing spread across the U.S., including in places that have had very tough economic times in recent years. And that's also reflected not just in economic numbers, but in sort of a despair factor by numbers of suicides, numbers of drug overdose deaths, which have risen dramatically in parts of the United States.
Michael, could I ask you that same question, except your perspective as a European, on American inequality vis-a-vis inequality in Europe? Is there a big difference? Are there different factors that fuel that?
There's a big difference, but there's a big difference too between the nations, between the Eurozone and in Europe. And I still think that the social policy should remain a national decision. So, for example, in Germany, we have, with Belgium, Austria, and Germany, these are the three countries worldwide which do the most in redistribution of income. So there's a lot done in Germany to balance the income inequality. And those people who elected the right-wing parties in the last years, we discuss, of course, in Germany income inequality. But those people who elected right-wing and protest parties, this was about identity, it was about migration, but it was not about income inequality. And if you tell a German worker, for example, if you tell a German worker that the EU would like to start to battle income inequality by distributing EU-wide the wealth, then this German work, then you would have 40% for the right-wing party, because German workers fear that they spend too much to other countries in Europe. So this is a discussion on the national level, and I'm really for that nations in Europe take their responsibility for the budget too, and this is to defend Europe as a good idea and a principle, and we need Europe, and we need the give and take, and we need to stay common and in the next years and decades. But the debates are not honest in Europe. The most important election in Europe are the European elections next year. But in Germany and in other countries as well, politicians tend to tell the people, if good things happen, it's decided on the national level, it's good for national elections, and bad things that happen are done in Brussels. And that's not fair, and we can't go on like that. And I think people start to develop some more European conscience these years.
Thank you. There's a gentleman right here. Can we get a microphone?
Yes, Artis Lēņš. I'm a member of the Latvian Parliament and I'm on the European Affairs Committee, and I really enjoyed listening to former Prime Minister of Latvia, Commissioner Dombrovskis. But I would like our Minister of Finance, Dana Reizniece-Ozola, to say a few words about the wonder, the miracle that has happened in Latvia, that we have actually decreased, albeit very little, the Gini coefficient. We have decreased inequality in Latvia.
You have, I'm sorry.
Decreased it.
Decreased.
Yeah, so we're the only country, right? Listening to the panelists.
All right.
Okay. I'm just, that's not serious. But we have done it. We have done it, and that is a big step forward, isn't it? At least it has been reduced somewhat. So please, Minister.
Thank you for the question, because we do understand that the inequalities do make the sound grounds for raising populism. While we were carrying out our tax reform, and it is very funny that out of all the OECD countries, last year there are 4 countries that were implementing notable tax reform. 2 of them that were mentioned and analyzed, it is the US and Latvia. So we will have a good chance to compare the results. While we were actually thinking of the dual use tax reform, one side of it was really boosting the competitiveness of the businesses. We reconstructed the whole corporate income tax system. While the companies are investing in their development, they do not have to pay the tax at all. When they are dividing the dividends, they do pay it, and the tax rate was raised. But at the same time, we were reforming the labor tax, increasing the progressivity in both the rates and non-taxable minimum, thus decreasing the inequalities. So let us see what the results are.
Okay, more questions. Yes, there's a gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm the ambassador of Italy here in Latvia.
Perfect timing.
I was interested, yes, in your replies, and I appreciate the positions of Commissioner Dombrovskis and his reactions. Yeah, I think little is known about what's going on in Italy and why the government is proposing such a dramatic shift in its the new budget. The reason is simply income inequality. One of the main reasons is that. I mean, unfortunately, during the campaign, it was clear that one of the main way to win the consensus, especially in southern Italy, where people are poorer, was for the Five Stars Party to propose 800 euros per person who was poor or unoccupied. So they have to find a way to finance that. So that's a difficulty they're facing, because right now their electorate is asking just that. You know, devolve what you promised. But this said, then I make reference to the comment, you know, nations should take care of their problems and so on. It's a fact in Italy there has always been a divide. The rich has always been rich, sorry, the north has always been rich, and the south has always been poor. So the common market didn't work, the EU common market. The cohesion funds didn't work. There were many policies adopted that did not work. So my question is there a way to solve that? Is there a way to make a common market work totally, fully? Another remark from the other side about aging. I'd just like to stress that there was a very interesting conference here in Riga about 5G revolution. I must say I went there for just half an hour and I was amazed. It was like watching a sci-fi movie. It will totally change our lives. You know, even we won't have to drive cars anymore. We don't have to. It will be very helpful, and we aging population that will actually live in a couple of, maybe in a decade or so, even up to 125 years old, I think we will benefit from this 5G revolution. It will help us a lot. So I would look with optimism at our lives in a few decades, right?
A rare moment of optimism in this discussion. Michael, that's a good question. How do you answer?
That's a very interesting question. And I mean, of course, if a national Italian government is elected with a promise to pay a basic income with 800 euros a month, they are allowed and they have the legitimation to do that. Quite fair. But it's a national decision, and then they should raise taxes for the rich in Italy. And they should not claim more debt in Europe or more funds or new funds in Europe. That's my point. So they can do everything on the national level as far as they accept the European and common rules, so they can tax Italian rich people much more. And what Berlusconi never did in the 80s, for example, he didn't really tax the people in the north of Italy. So there were so many exceptions, so many things, from the cafes to the taxis. There were no how do you call these, receipts. So many things were on the black side and were not really imposed. So it's a national decision. You can pay a basic income, but you have to look in your nation. It's a redistribution, and as well in the geographic matter. In Germany, we have a federal system. In France, is centralized, but in Germany, we have a federalist system. And since 50 or 60 years, Bavaria is paying for Bremen in the north, which doesn't grow that much, or for Saarland, or for other poor parts of the country. So we didn't have much change, unfortunately, but still the system works, and the inequality is balanced to some extent. So this is a question in Italy, and if Italy guarantees to Southern Tyrol an autonomy which says every tax that comes in there is only spent there, I mean that's an Italian discussion, and I don't like it very much if you always look, or if people in general, and Germany did that under Schröder too, we broke the rules too. So everybody to some point made mistakes from the European point of view, and we really should try to be more disciplined now altogether and look at our national level. If we want to spend some money, we have to raise some money too, and it's the same for France, because a lot of the proposals Emmanuel Macron did, a lot of these proposals are not about more sovereignty for Europe, more competences for Brussels, less competences for the French Parliament or for the German Bundestag. I would agree with that. But they are not about that, but they are just about new funds and new money and new burden sharing, which means in these days that Germany would have to spend a bit more. So I don't think that we could go on in Europe like that. It's a national Italian decision, and they have all the means to do that.
Donna, do you agree?
If it's possible, I would just like to add on as a continuation. If the country does its homework, implementing the structural reforms, keeping the economy open, it works. The single market has worked for us. The cohesion policies have worked for us. Just as an example, 7% of our GDP has been ensured by the successful cohesion policy implemented here since we've joined the European Union. But the rules, if we have set them together, they have to be followed and the necessary reforms implemented. And the Commission has to help. You are the guardian angels of the rules, and you must be like the shepherds that smell like the sheep, helping Italy to implement their difficult reforms so that to afford the things so necessary for your people as well.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to give you one more word, but I think we need to get more questions, but interesting. There's a woman right there, if we can get a microphone to her.
Hello, thank you for a great panel. My name is Ellen Schiffer. I'm from Sweden. I have a question. You were talking a lot about the demographic problem, and you were talking about how youth issues weren't debated in Germany. And I was wondering, how do we include youth more in the conversation about the future of the economy, because we are the ones that are going to tackle the future challenges, and we need to be included more in the dialogue. And I was wondering, what are the possible action paths, and who are responsible for taking those? Is it the EU, is it the national governments, or is it the civil society? Thank you.
Who has an answer? Michael?
Well, first it's about civil society. In Germany, the people with the highest electoral turnout are between 60 and 70. And the people who have the lowest electoral turnout are between 18 and 30. So they don't go to the polls. And we are telling for 10 years now to young people, if you don't go vote, you can't complain to politicians if they only raise pensions. So, and we had a turnout, an up in the turnout for young people of 10% last election. So things are starting to change. And we are saying young people today that they can't allow what I did when I was 20. I didn't think of my pension. But people that are 20 or 25 today, they have to look at that.
Okay, thank you. You've got a question right there in the middle.
Yeah, hello. My name is Aldis Austers from Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I have a question to a representative from Germany, because Germany is also a country which has not followed the recommendations from the European Commission. Talking here about the current account surplus, which is very huge in case of Germany. And it is hurting other countries, not only in Europe, but around the globe. And Germany has been acting against liberalization of services market, because in industrial market we have a single market, but not in services. And countries like Latvia has competitive edge exactly in services market. And now you're talking about the need to spend more money for cohesion. The German people don't want that much money spent on cohesion. But on the other hand, if you would liberalize market and services, it would give a growth opportunity for our countries, and less cohesion money would be needed in future. What's your opinion?
You're in the hot seat, Michael.
Well, I'm far from saying that Germany is perfect, and in the European Union, Germany doesn't behave perfectly too. So sometimes the automotive industry, automobile industry, they influence on the chancellor, and then there is some ruling in Brussels that is not done. Of course, Germany is far from being perfect, and if the aim should always be to have a maximum open markets and maximum fair trade, and of course it's a give and take. And we look as a think tank in Germany that's advertising for market economy and for fair trade and fair competition. Of course, we often criticize German government in Germany because they don't allow that, and we sometimes criticize the EU too because they erect trade barriers, for example for nations from Africa. So there is a lot to do. It's far from being perfect.
Okay. It turns out that we have a little bit more time. We were going to end at 7:45, but we have about maybe 5 more minutes. So we have time for a question, or if we don't have questions from the audience, I have a question. Yes, sir.
I'm Karthik Desai, Chairman of the Board of SIA Balto Winds. My suggestion and a question is about equitable opportunities for the skill development. Although EU has a research budget of more than 480 billion euro, but if you see, most part of it is concentrated only in few parts of the member states, and most part of largely the Baltics and the Eastern Europe states, the universities, they don't have those upgraded research lab facilities. So how do you view this point? If you have better skill development opportunities, then there will be automatically better equitable distribution of wealth.
Anybody want to take that question?
Okay, as regards research and innovation, I think it's indeed a very valid question, because if you look at the budget for research and innovation, how it's geographically distributed, 95% of money, or somewhere in that range, maybe 94%, goes to the Western Europe 5%, 6% maybe goes to the Eastern Europe. And then, of course, you may ask, so where the excellence will be? Where the 94% of the money goes, or where the 6% of the money goes? So clearly, this is something which needs to be addressed, that we reach more equitable distribution. Of course, there is a counter-argument that, well, there needs to be an excellence. So, but I think there are ways of doing, of actually teaming up the relevant research institutions and finding ways that indeed more money on research and innovation actually also goes to the Central Eastern Europe, so that the region can actually catch up also in terms of its research and innovation capacities.
You know, I think maybe we'll have one more question, and I think maybe I'll ask it quickly. But Christian, this would be to you. We're both Americans. So I have a question that actually has a connection with economics, the EU, and it also has a connection with NATO, which is there have been other presidents who have made some similar arguments to what President Trump is making. Europe doesn't contribute enough, in quotes, to NATO, or European trade deals and rules are not fair to the United States. But President Trump came in with a very hard line on that and attacked the Europeans for, again, taking advantage of the United States, ripping off the United States, and also at one point early in the discussion about NATO, saying, maybe we ought to pull out. Why do we need it? Why do we need to defend little tiny countries? And we're in an area of 3 quite small countries. And I guess my question is, if you can make that argument in different ways, but President Trump has made it in a very, let's say, hard-edged way. Was that necessary? And ultimately, you can patch it up and you can say, yes, we'll have agreements, and yes, maybe we won't do tariffs and all of this. But has he damaged relations with Europe by taking that hard-edged approach?
Well, Jill, I think that's a great question. My own view is that he's actually given NATO a bit of a lifeline. Be very easy, and the terrific discussion earlier, I think, touched upon this. Be very easy for me to come and say the alliance is great, the alliance will last forever. Fundamental problem with NATO is we're in 3 small countries, 1 small country, 2 small countries next to it, that actually, with Latvia pulling the agreed upon share of 2%, I think Poland at 1.9%, but then as you move farther away, in particular Germany at 1.2%, Iceland doesn't have a military, it's very small, but the worst of all in NATO is Canada at 1%. You know, what Trump is doing is giving Europe a chance, I think, to respond and keep the United States in. Because if you look at it from the point of view of the Trump administrations and of others in America who are looking at the world today, Russia is not the top threat. It may seem like the top threat because of our media, because people in both political parties find it beneficial to say it's the top threat. Much of the media is driving that, I think. But China is the key threat to the United States. It's the one with a massive economy. It's the one that wants to kick us out of the Western Pacific, where we sort of have played the role of a guarantor of freedom of navigation, etc. It's the one that has global reach. So China up here is a threat. Next is actually probably Iran and its export of terrorism, of violent jihad. Next, you might put jihadists elsewhere, and only 4th, really, Russia. So if you're faced with a growing China, you're faced with a belligerent China, can you afford really to keep spending so much on NATO? And for many of the reasons that were articulated earlier, yes, Trump is being very blunt, but I think that's partly a reaction to softer messaging, which I saw in the Bush administration and with President Obama tried repeatedly, not really having an effect.
Okay. Well, thank you. On that note, I think that's a good subject to discuss over dinner. I'm sure there are various views. But this panel was really excellent. I want to thank everybody who was involved, and the questions were excellent. And I do have one housekeeping detail, which is we can go to dinner directly after this discussion. There will be volunteers outside who will guide you to the location, which is very close by. And again, Valdis, Dana, Christian, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.